May 1945. Bavaria. The war was over, but the silence that followed felt heavier than artillery fire. The mountains stood calm against a gray horizon, their slopes scarred by months of retreat and defeat. In the valley below, an American detention camp sprawled across the muddy fields, rows of barbed wire, canvas tents, and a wooden barn that once stored hay. Inside that barn, the air smelled of dust, sweat, and something new, music. A military gramophone crackled out a slow, uncertain tune. A handful of U.S. soldiers, barely older than 20, had gathered near the doorway, passing around tin mugs and cigarettes. One of them adjusted the record, trying to lighten the mood. Another laughed, nervously, as he glanced toward a group of German women sitting by the far wall. They were prisoners, captured auxiliaries from nearby Wehrmacht support units. Their uniforms had been stripped of insignia, their faces of expression. Some still wore their hair in tight braids. Others stared at the floor, their hands resting in their laps. A young sergeant, his jacket unbuttoned, walked across the barn floor. His boots echoed on the wooden boards. He stopped in front of the women, smiled, and gestured toward the space cleared in the center of the room. "A dance," he said softly, more to himself than to them. The interpreter repeated the words in German. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a burst of quiet laughter. One woman covered her mouth, another shook her head, whispering something that made the others smirk. To the Americans, it was an invitation, an attempt at normalcy in a world just beginning to breathe again. To the captives, it was absurd, the victors asking the defeated to dance amid the wreckage of their nation. Outside, a flag fluttered on a wooden pole. The sun began to fall behind the hills. Inside, the record kept spinning, its melody trembling through the barn. And in that strange, quiet moment, between pride and pity, between freedom and captivity, the war, for the first time, truly felt over. The war in Europe had ended only days earlier. On May 8, 1945, Germany's unconditional surrender silenced 6 years of destruction, but victory did not bring instant peace. Across the continent, millions wandered through a landscape of ruins. Bombed cities smoldered. Bridges lay twisted in rivers. Entire divisions of soldiers had vanished into captivity. In southern Germany, the U.S. Army established dozens of temporary internment and processing camps. They were built hastily on farmland, in abandoned airfields, or inside old German barracks. The goal was not punishment, at least not yet. It was control. The Allied command needed to register every surrendering unit, separate military from civilian, and identify members of the SS or Nazi organizations. Among the prisoners were tens of thousands of women, auxiliaries of the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe clerks, Red Cross nurses, communications staff, and field secretaries. Some had followed frontline units out of duty or ideology. Others had simply been caught in the tide of retreat. Now, stripped of rank and purpose, they were marched into fenced compounds under the eyes of foreign guards. For the Americans, it was a logistical nightmare. Tens of thousands of German soldiers and civilians crowded makeshift enclosures meant for a fraction of that number. Rations were limited, sanitation poor, and morale almost non-existent. The U.S. troops, many veterans of brutal fighting in the Ardennes or the Rhineland, found themselves in charge of people they had been trained to kill just weeks earlier. Yet the tone inside these camps was complex. There was discipline but also curiosity. The young GIs had never seen Germany beyond the battlefield, and now they lived among its remnants. They saw the faces of the enemy up close, exhausted, thin, proud, and suddenly human. For the German women, captivity carried a different weight. Many feared retribution or humiliation. Rumors spread quickly, stories of Soviet camps, of disappearances in the East. The American zones were viewed as safer, even civilized, but they were still prison grounds. In this uncertain quiet, laughter became rare, and trust almost non-existent. The camp at the edge of that Bavarian valley was typical, barbed wire, watchtowers, and a barn turned into a holding hall. It was here, in a place meant for counting prisoners, that something unusual happened, an invitation, simple yet unsettling, that would expose the fragile boundaries between conqueror and captive. In the weeks following Germany's surrender, the Allied command faced a humanitarian crisis of scale unseen in modern history. Nearly 11 million German soldiers had laid down their arms. Civilians fled westward by the millions, seeking refuge from the advancing Red Army. The U.S. military administration, now occupying Bavaria and Hesse, struggled to feed and process a broken nation. The camps that dotted the countryside were intended as temporary holding zones, yet many became semi-permanent. Fences went up faster than shelters. Prisoners slept in barns, schools, or open fields. The Geneva Convention technically applied, but enforcement varied. In American camps, rations were limited but fair. Prisoners were organized into work details, clearing rubble, digging latrines, rebuilding bridges. Discipline remained strict but generally humane, at least compared to conditions in the East. Among these vast numbers, female prisoners were a small but visible group. They included communications officers from Luftwaffe command centers, nurses from field hospitals, and auxiliaries from the Reich Labor Service. Many had served in non-combat roles, but the uniform marked them as part of the defeated machine. When captured, they were separated from men and quartered under light guard, not out of leniency, but due to logistical and moral caution. American records from the Third Army's occupation reports describe such groups as non-combatant female personnel detained for screening. They were questioned for intelligence, checked for party affiliation, then assigned to daily routines. For many, it was the first time being in close proximity to American soldiers without fear. The mood inside those compounds was peculiar, neither violent nor friendly. The Americans were young, homesick, often unsure how to behave toward women they had been taught to see as part of the enemy. The Germans, on the other hand, held on to fragments of pride, unable to comprehend defeat yet painfully aware of their vulnerability. And so, between these two worlds, the victors with cigarettes and jazz records, and the defeated with their quiet poise, an uneasy rhythm developed. Communication passed through gestures more than words. An offered cigarette, a polite nod, a fleeting smile that meant little but felt enormous. Then, one evening, in a camp barn where hay once stored horses, someone decided to play a record. A small act, part boredom, part defiance of monotony. But in a place where every movement was regulated, it became something else entirely. The gramophone clicked, the soldiers gathered, and history's strangest dance invitation was about to be made. The record needle trembled, catching light from a swinging bulb. What followed would blur the line between pity, irony, and the faint echo of lost humanity. The story of that evening cannot be understood through one perspective alone. It unfolded at the crossroads of exhaustion, morality, and the strange humanity that emerges when war finally releases its grip. To see it clearly, one must look through several lenses, each revealing something different about that moment when a group of American soldiers asked their captives to dance. Most of the GIs stationed in southern Germany in May 1945 were barely out of adolescence. They had crossed Europe through mud, snow, and blood, from Normandy to the Rhine. Many had lost friends days before the armistice. For them, the war had not ended cleanly, it had simply stopped. The habits of caution and command still ruled their behavior. But beneath the uniform, they were still young men, suddenly idle in a defeated land. That night in the barn, the invitation to dance was not romantic, it was human. It was the instinct to feel normal again. To replace the sound of artillery with music, the weight of rifles with the rhythm of a record. In their minds, perhaps, it was a gesture of reconciliation. A fragile bridge between enemies who now shared the same hunger, boredom, and loneliness. Across the room sat women who had once served the regime those same men had fought to destroy. Their faces revealed no warmth. Some refused eye contact altogether. Yet, Deep inside, they too were prisoners of memory, haunted by the destruction their nation had unleashed and by what awaited them outside those fences. The laughter that followed the invitation was not cruel. It was nervous, defensive, ironic, the laughter of people who no longer knew what dignity looked like. From the American command's perspective, the camp was part of a vast logistical network. Every prisoner needed classification, documentation, and controlled routine. Boredom, unrest, and emotional entanglement were considered risks. Soldiers were warned against fraternization, particularly with German civilians and female detainees. But paper rules often bent under the pressure of human nature. The dance in the barn was never authorized. It was a moment of unauthorized normalcy in a sea of regulation. The guards, mostly enlisted men, understood that a bit of music could calm restless prisoners and lift morale. If it blurred lines between captor and captive, they ignored it. After all, the war was over. Reports from similar camps note instances of informal gatherings, GIs sharing rations, trading small gifts, even allowing prisoners to listen to American radio. These gestures, though technically breaches of policy, reflected a quiet truth. Occupation was not only about control, it was about coexistence. Still, there was risk. The U.S. Army of 1945 was not immune to moral scrutiny. Public opinion, discipline, and racial politics were all at stake. For officers, anything that hinted at sympathy toward the enemy could be questioned. Thus, moments like that dance were rarely documented, existing only in memory, whispered years later as anecdotes from a war too complex for black and white judgment. At its heart, the barn scene was not about romance or rebellion. It was about the tension between regulation and emotion, between the machinery of victory and the fragility of human decency. The gramophone kept playing, the soldiers uncertain whether to laugh or to stop the record. And on the other side of the barn, the women, still in worn uniforms, exchanged glances that spoke louder than any words. The air carried both unease and recognition. For the first time, they were not enemies, just survivors of the same catastrophe. The dance had not yet begun, but the moral questions had. For many German captives, the sound that filled that barn, the swing rhythm, the jazz chords, the crackle of an American gramophone, was unlike anything they had heard before. Under the Third Reich, such music had been labeled Entartete Musik, degenerate. Jazz was banned from the radio. Saxophones were symbols of corruption. Yet here it was, drifting through the wooden beams of a Bavarian barn, played by the soldiers of a nation that had turned sound into a weapon of morale. American swing had marched alongside its armies, lifting spirits across continents. To the GIs, that music meant home, freedom, a taste of youth stolen by years of war. To the captured women, it represented defeat, but also something unfamiliar and strangely alive. As the record spun, one could sense the invisible exchange taking place, culture replacing command, rhythm replacing fear. It was not about joy. It was about the human instinct to seek sound in silence. That gramophone, a small piece of technology, carried more power than any rifle that had entered Germany months before. The German women, though captured, were not broken. Many had been raised in a world that glorified discipline, loyalty, and sacrifice. Defeat was something abstract, a concept too vast to feel in a single moment. But captivity was concrete. The barbed wire, the rations, the watchtowers, these were daily reminders that the Reich was gone. When the Americans asked them to dance, they heard not kindness, but condescension. To them, the invitation was a humiliation disguised as civility. How could they, proud servants of a fallen nation, accept amusement from their conquerors? And yet, somewhere behind the smirks and laughter, a quiet understanding lingered. The men in front of them were no longer the enemy in uniform, but simply men, tired, awkward, alive. Later memoirs of German auxiliaries describe similar emotions, resentment mixed with relief, defiance masking despair. "We laughed," one woman recalled, "because we didn't know whether to cry." Their laughter, therefore, was not rejection, it was defense. It was how one maintains dignity when dignity is gone. To the American soldiers, the war's end had not brought triumph. Many expected relief, even joy, but instead felt confusion. They had seen death too often to celebrate it. Their compassion, once hardened by necessity, began to resurface, and with it came guilt. The line between right and wrong blurred as they faced their former enemies, not as soldiers, but as human beings. Psychologists studying post-war occupation later noted how soldiers struggled to reconcile power and empathy. Command gave them control, conscience demanded restraint. In that barn, the invitation to dance symbolized this internal conflict. It was a gesture of mercy wrapped in discomfort, the victors trying, perhaps clumsily, to feel innocent again. The laughter of the German women only deepened that discomfort. It reminded the soldiers that moral victory is never complete, that even kindness can be misunderstood when power defines the space between people. So the music continued, low, imperfect, haunted. Neither side truly moved. The dance remained an idea, suspended in the air like dust caught in sunlight. The barn, a makeshift stage, had become a mirror reflecting both the fragility and the absurdity of post-war peace. Outside, dusk thickened. The guards shifted in silence. Somewhere beyond the camp, villagers began rebuilding what was left of their lives. Inside, the record slowed, then stopped, leaving behind the faint hiss of a needle over empty grooves. That hiss, more than the music itself, marked the true sound of the moment, the uneasy quiet of. The silence would not last long. Soon, decisions would be made, by officers, by circumstance, that would test what remained of empathy on both sides. Night settled over the camp like a heavy curtain. The floodlights hummed above the wire, and the last traces of sunset faded into the dark blue of a Bavarian spring sky. Inside the barn, the air was close and quiet. The gramophone had fallen still, the needle resting at the center of the record. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. The laughter had faded, leaving behind a faint echo that seemed to embarrass everyone who'd heard it. The young sergeant who'd offered the invitation, his name lost to history, stood awkwardly, one hand on his belt, the other holding a cigarette that had gone cold. He looked at the women again. They were silent, their expressions unreadable in the dim light. Somewhere behind them, one of the guards whispered something in English. A comment, perhaps, or a joke meant to break the tension. No one laughed. Then, quietly, the sergeant nodded to the soldier by the gramophone. The record was changed. A new tune began, slower, softer, almost mournful. It wasn't swing this time. It was a waltz, the kind played at farewell dances back home. The first bars drifted out into the night, reaching beyond the open barn doors, out toward the guard towers, where sentries turned their heads to listen. And then, something small, almost imperceptible, happened. One of the women, a nurse, barely in her 20s, stood up. Her uniform jacket was too large, her hands trembling slightly as she brushed the dust from her skirt. She didn't move toward the Americans, not quite. But she didn't sit down either. Her gesture broke the stillness. The sergeant took a hesitant step forward, unsure whether to approach or retreat. The woman's eyes met his for an instant, an exchange that said nothing and everything. He stopped halfway, his boots creaking against the wooden floor. It wasn't a dance. Not yet. But in that moment, something shifted. The silence no longer belonged to victory or defeat. It belonged to two sides of a war that no longer knew how to face each other. A guard by the doorway turned away, pretending not to notice. Another soldier, seated near the wall, rubbed his eyes as if the scene were too strange to be real. The waltz continued, its rhythm fragile but persistent. The nurse sat back down. The sergeant exhaled, almost smiling. The record spun until the end, and for the first time that night, no one laughed. It was the kind of stillness that follows after a storm, not peace, but recognition. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, carrying with it the faint echo of the waltz, a sound both foreign and familiar in a land learning to breathe again. The next few minutes passed like a held breath. The soldiers stood in small groups, their postures uncertain, half ashamed, half curious. The German women remained seated, their laughter now replaced by a quiet tension that filled the room like smoke. The waltz reached its final refrain. The sergeant, still rooted to the spot, flicked his cigarette to the ground and crushed it beneath his boot. Then he spoke softly to the interpreter. Whatever he said made the man hesitate, then nod. The interpreter turned toward the women and translated. "You don't have to dance. We just wanted you to know, the war's over." There was no response. Only the crackling of the record's final groove. For a long moment, the barn became a space outside time. No orders, no chains of command, just faces illuminated by the weak yellow bulb hanging from the rafters. Some of the American soldiers looked away, ashamed of their own gesture, suddenly realizing how absurd it must have seemed. Others stood still, staring at the floor, each man processing what victory had truly meant. On the other side, one woman began to cry quietly. Not from fear or humiliation, but from exhaustion, from the sheer weight of everything that had collapsed around her. Her tears drew no attention. Everyone in that room understood that crying at that moment belonged to all of them. Then, without warning, the generator outside cut out. The light died, plunging the barn into darkness. Someone cursed softly in English. Another struck a match, its flare revealing for a heartbeat the contours of tired faces, foreign and familiar all at once. When the light returned, the women were standing. All of them. Not approaching, not surrendering to the gesture, but standing as if to reclaim the space around them. A silent declaration that they were still human. The sergeant nodded once, faintly, a gesture of respect rather than command. Then he turned, motioned to the others, and left the barn. One by one, the soldiers followed, their boots thudding on the boards. The women remained where they were until the sound of footsteps faded. Then, one of them reached over and stopped the record player. The needle lifted with a dry click. Silence again. But it was a different silence now, not the silence of war's end, but the beginning of understanding. That night, guards reported no incidents. The logbook recorded nothing unusual. Yet, for those who were there, the event stayed vivid, not because of what happened, but because of what almost did. In the long years that followed, the barn itself would disappear. The camp would be dismantled, the fields returned to farmers. But among the few who remembered, the story survived, of a night when victors invited the defeated to dance, and both realized how heavy freedom could feel. By dawn, mist covered the valley. The war was over, but the world had not yet learned how to live without it. The morning after the barn incident, life in the camp returned to its regulated rhythm. Soldiers distributed rations, counted heads, and supervised work details. The women returned to their assigned quarters, moving with the quiet efficiency of those trained to survive in a strict hierarchy. The laughter of the previous evening seemed almost a memory, a fragile thread connecting the harsh reality of captivity to a fleeting moment of shared humanity. For the Americans, the event was a small victory of morale rather than strategy. Officers noted in the daily logs the importance of maintaining discipline while allowing minor reprieves for prisoners. Such allowances were not acts of leniency, but pragmatic choices. Camp administration understood that restlessness could breed defiance. A small moment of music or a brief exchange of civility often prevented far greater disruptions. Among the women, reactions varied. Some quietly resented the gesture, viewing it as patronizing or absurd. Others had been relieved to see the soldiers behave with a measure of restraint, their invitation offering a fleeting sense of normalcy. Memoirs of German auxiliaries captured this ambivalence. Laughter and tears often existed side by side, a mixture of defiance and exhaustion. Medical reports from the camp indicate that several women experienced heightened anxiety after interactions with the soldiers, not from fear of violence, but from the disorienting juxtaposition of safety and humiliation. These psychological effects lingered, marking the difference between surviving captivity and processing defeat. The barn itself became, for a time, a symbol of tension within the camp. Guards and soldiers alike were cautious about repeating such gestures. Yet the memory of the evening remained vivid. Diaries, letters, and post-war interviews recount the incident with a mixture of disbelief and reflection. In the wider context, the camp's routines mirrored the broader Allied effort to manage millions of former soldiers and civilian personnel. Transportation logistics, work assignments, and repatriation planning consumed officers' attention. Every interaction, even one as seemingly trivial as a dance invitation, had implications for the psychology of occupation. The women moved through the compound under watchful eyes, carrying their pride like armor. And beyond the fences, the world they had known, the Reich, the cities, the families, lay in ruins. In the weeks that followed, the German women were gradually processed for release or reassignment. Some were transferred to labor detachments, clearing roads or assisting in rebuilding towns devastated by bombing. Others remained in the camp for months, waiting for bureaucratic decisions to catch up with the chaos of post-war Europe. The memories of the barn lingered quietly, an unspoken anecdote among the monotony of camp life. The American soldiers, too, carried their own recollections. Letters home described the strange, fleeting normalcy of the event, a momentary pause in a war defined by orders and gunfire. For many, the incident remained a lesson in humility. Victory, they realized, was not only about defeating an enemy, but also about understanding what it meant to hold power without cruelty. Historians examining occupation reports note that such human moments shaped the conduct of U.S. forces in Germany. By allowing small gestures of civility, even amid strict supervision, officers helped reduce tension and maintain order. It was an early illustration of the psychological dimension of post-war control, that discipline alone could not ensure stability. Empathy, even awkward or constrained, was necessary. For the women, reintegration into civilian life was slow and complicated. Social stigma awaited many who had served in auxiliary roles, regardless of their actual duties. Families often struggled to reconcile pride, shame, and survival. Some women recounted the dance incident years later with a mixture of amusement and disbelief, noting how odd it seemed that the victors had offered them a moment of levity amid their captivity. On a broader scale, the episode reflects the larger paradox of post-war Europe, immense destruction paired with the fragile restoration of humanity. In thousands of camps, countless similar interactions occurred, small, undocumented, and yet profoundly revealing about human resilience. The barn dance, in its subtlety, captured the tension between power and empathy, authority and dignity, loss and fleeting grace. By the time the camp was dismantled, the physical traces were gone, barbed wire removed, buildings repurposed, fields returned to farmers. But the memory remained, a night when defeated women laughed at their captors' invitation, and both sides glimpsed a measure of understanding in the ruins of war. The silence of the empty barn contrasted sharply with the echo of that waltz, the memory of laughter, and the delicate bridge built between captor and captive. In the quiet years after the war, historians and psychologists alike have returned to moments like that barn dance to understand the human side of victory. It was not the battles, the strategies, or the numbers alone that defined the end of the Third Reich, but these fragile, fleeting interactions, moments when the machinery of war met the unpredictability of human emotion. The laughter of the German women, the hesitant gestures of the American soldiers, the uncertain waltz spinning from a simple gramophone, all of it captured the paradox of post-war existence. For the victors, the war was over, yet their own sense of morality was tested. For the captives, defeat was complete, yet dignity remained intact, hidden in small acts of defiance, in laughter, in refusal to bow to absurdity. Such moments reveal that war does not end with treaties or surrenders. It lingers in gestures, in silences, in the careful navigation of power and vulnerability. The barn, with its creaking floors and swinging light bulb, became a stage where the human consequences of victory were performed without script. The soldiers were not generals, the women not warriors in battle, but each played a role in a moral reckoning far beyond the front lines. Historians note that these interactions shaped the tone of the occupation. Where authority was tempered with restraint, order was easier to maintain. Where small acts of humanity appeared, they left lasting impressions on both captor and captive. The barn dance was one such act, seemingly trivial, yet profoundly revealing. It demonstrated that empathy, even in tiny measures, can survive the brutality of war. For the women, the memory persisted, a night of laughter amid defeat, a moment where the impossible briefly seemed possible. For the soldiers, it was a reminder that victory carried responsibility, that power without conscience leaves only emptiness. And for posterity, it stands as a quiet testament to resilience, dignity, and the subtle ways human beings navigate trauma and reconciliation. In the end, the barn no longer stands, the records have faded, and the participants have passed into history. Yet the story remains, a snapshot of a world struggling to rebuild, where music, courage, and humor found a fragile foothold in the aftermath of unimaginable violence. The war had ended, but the echoes of that evening remind us that the truest battles are not always fought with weapons. They are fought in silence, in laughter, and in the delicate space where empathy meets authority. And it is there, in that fragile, fleeting human connection, that the world begins to learn how to live again. The record may have stopped, the barn may have emptied, but the memory endures, a quiet dance in the shadow of history.